Welcome, everyone. We're here today for the third session of our Community of Conscience Listening Forum. This series is convened by AJC's Community of Conscience Coalition, which was launched last year to advance our shared values of pluralism, civil discourse, and mutual respect. Among our coalition's membership, we count top faith, ethnic, civic, and elected leaders from around the community. These leaders unite across diverse backgrounds and perspectives to honor the American ideal as together we strive to form a more perfect union. We appear to find ourselves in a watershed moment in our nation's history. The murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and far too many other Black lives have sparked a national and even global conversation that somehow seems different than at times in the past. For the first time since the civil rights era, one can sense a real opportunity for significant systemic change. In June, under the leadership of Community of Conscience members Catherine McGill, Pastor and State Representative Carl Sherman, Imam Khalid Shahid, as well as Dr. Lindsey Wilson, Interim Equity Officer for the City of Dallas and moderator of today's panel, planning began on this series of listening and learning opportunities. The idea behind it is to do a deep dive into issues of racism and white supremacy that will inform future advocacy efforts. As a supplement to these sessions, our wonderful summer intern, Carly Hacker, has put together a resource guide with suggested additional readings, bios of the speakers, and relevant statistics. We have decided to hold off on sending this guide out until the end because we want to include links to the videos of each session. So everyone who's registered for these programs will receive a link to the guide in their email or maybe the actual guide as an attachment at the conclusion of the series. Throughout our 113-year plus history, AJC has consistently worked to advance equity, advocate for civil and human rights, and celebrate diversity. We recognize that the fight against bigotry, anti-Semitism, and hate is all of our responsibilities, and we are proud to convene these sessions as an important part of that process. Before I turn the program over to Lindsey to moderate, I want to remind everyone that AJC is a nonpartisan 501c3 organization. I'd also like to ask that everyone but our speakers please remain on mute. And if you have a question, and we'll remind you again during the course of the morning, please email that question to dallas@ajc.org. Final bit of housekeeping. As we planned these sessions, the committee placed a high value on creating a sense of community by using the meeting format rather than the webinar format in which you would only see the panelists. I have personally found it meaningful in meetings like this to toggle between the gallery view and the speaker view so that I can, in the gallery view, feel like I'm part of a larger group, and in the speaker view, really focus on the presenters and what they would like to share with us. And you can do this by clicking where indicated at the upper right-hand corner of your screen. It now gives me a great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Our moderator, Dr. Lindsey Wilson, holds a master's in counseling and a doctoral degree in educational psychology, both from the University of Washington. Her focus was on the intersectionality of racial disparities, community engagement, and socioeconomics. She currently serves as the Interim Equity Officer for the City of Dallas Office of Equity. Prior to her current position, Lindsey served in various capacities advancing equity efforts with Snohomish County in Everett, Washington. She holds over 10 years of experience in local government. Dallas City Council member Casey Thomas represents District 3. He serves as chair of the Workforce, Education, and Equity Committee. This committee is responsible for overseeing the city's workforce development strategy, as well as implementation of the city's resiliency plan to make Dallas a more equitable city. He also chairs the mayor's Complete Count Committee for the 2020 census. He serves on the Public Safety Committee, where he led the council effort to establish the Community Police Oversight Board, which of course ties into next week's discussion on policing. Our next speaker, Drexell Owusu, is Senior Vice President of Education and Workforce for the Dallas Regional Chamber, where he leads the DRC's efforts to grow and develop our existing regional talent and workforce. Prior to joining DRC, Drexell was founder and CEO of Brave Capital Partners, an investment company focused on catalyzing minority communities in Dallas. Prior to founding Brave, he served as managing director and chief of staff for Civitas Capital Group. While at Civitas, he was responsible for managing the Grow South Fund, which focuses on investing in Southern Dallas. I'd also like to give a warm welcome to former DRC president and last year's AJC Human Relations Award winner, Hilda Galvin. Hilda, welcome. We're so glad you're with us this morning. Finally, Angie Lee serves as director of the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for RISD. One of my daughters is an RISD student, and so I'm especially glad to have her here and look forward to hearing from her. She holds master's degrees in curriculum and instruction, as well as in education administration. Prior to her current role, she spent time as a secondary English teacher, a reading specialist, and as an assistant principal, and now directs that office for RISD. Lindsey, the floor is yours. Welcome, everyone.
Good morning, good morning. Thank you so very much, Joel, for that introduction and including me in today's conversation surrounding the topic of equity, which I hold dear to my heart. On this lovely Tuesday morning, we are certainly in for a treat given the knowledge, experience, and commitment that each one of our panelists brings to today's conversation. I had a chance to tune into the first two listening forums and know that equity fits at the center of those conversations, so I look forward to our next hour that we spend together. We have 6 specific questions that will allow the panelists to answer, followed by a few questions from the participants. So jumping right in, over the years, one of the first things that I have found to be critically important in spaces where we are discussing equity is to lay a common foundation surrounding the specific terms and or work that we're discussing, thus reducing any misalignment between terms, particularly equity and equality, which are oftentimes used either interchangeably or misused, yet we know they mean something completely different. So jumping in right into question 1, Angie, I'm going to start this first question with you as the director of Richardson's ISD's Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Would you say there's a difference between diversity, equity, and inclusion? And if so, how would you describe that difference?
I would say that there's absolutely a difference between diversity, equity, and did you say equality or inclusion? Lindsey?
Inclusion.
Inclusion. And so, you know, we like to define equity often in our district. You know, in education, we've moved away from really describing it as educational equality, but educational equity, because with equity, we know that we are putting more focus on the individuals and not on the whole. So we used to talk about equality in terms of fairness and everyone getting a piece of the pie, so to speak, making sure that everyone gets their slice. And then what we found out is that that's still not serving students equitably, because even when you get your fair slice, so to speak, with equality, you don't necessarily get what you need individually to make sure that you're gaining access and you have full, you know, rights to all that our district offers. And so we've moved to the word equity, looking at the individual child, what every single student needs in order to thrive and be successful. Diversity, we feel like we have a very diverse district, you know, with so many different populations of people represented. And so we pride ourselves on that. We are a very diverse district. However, diversity doesn't necessarily equate to equity. And we know that, so just because we are diverse, that does not mean that all students are being served well. And then we also know that diversity differs from inclusivity. We have to often look and make sure that all of our students, all of our families are experiencing an inclusive environment. So where they are fully embraced, fully accepted, authentically accepted for who they are and what they bring to the table. And so we like to look at inclusivity is, are we honoring every voice? Are we allowing every voice a seat at the table? Are we valuing everyone and how they identify their multiple identity markers that they come to school or come to work with every single day in order to be fully inclusive of who they are?
Thank you. Thank you for that distinction. We appreciate that. Passing the mic over to Councilmember Thomas. We know equity is one of the city's core values of service and one that you often keep at the center of various conversations. Can you expound on how equity and equality are different and why equity is so critical?
Very much so. First of all, thank you. I want to thank AGC for inviting me to be a part of this important conversation. It's always a pleasure to be with our chief, potentially future equity officer, Dr. Lindsey Wilson. She's done a great job since she's been with the city of Dallas. And thank you those who are participating. It's very important that we make a distinction between equity and equality. There's a number of visuals that do an excellent job of illustrating this difference. However, when we think about equality, equality means that everyone gets the exact same thing. Well, it's hard to focus on equality when there are historical disparities that have taken place. It's almost like running a 100-yard race and we're starting someone at the 50-yard line. And then you say, go. And when you say go, the person at the 50-yard line and 100-yard line leave at the exact same time. That's equality. However, equity is saying go and having the person at the 50-yard line wait until the person who's at the starting mark gets to the 50-yard line and then letting the person at the 50-yard line go. Now we have equality. And when we look at it in the form of municipal government, we know historically, not only the city of Dallas, but government has played a role in providing an unequal playing field through establishment of ordinances and policies. A good book, I'm a teacher in my previous life. I was a classroom teacher. And so a good book for those who are watching and those who are participating to read is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. The Color of Law talks about the ways in which the government put in place policies that intentionally allowed white males in particular, who are property owners, to receive certain benefits that people of color did not receive. And in that way, it unleveled the playing field. Here in Dallas, we have to acknowledge the fact that we have a very ugly past. In Dallas, there was a time that members of the Ku Klux Klan sat in the seat that I sit in and the seat that our mayor sat in. And then during that time, there were policies that were implemented that unjustly discriminated against people of color, in particular, Black people. And so in the time of the death of George Floyd, in the time of social justice, in the time of awakening, when we talk about equity and racial equity, we have to look and we have to see where we have put in place and underinvested in certain communities. And in order to bring about true equity in the city of Dallas, we have to overinvest in those communities. The timing is excellent because we're going through our budgeting process right now. And there's a lot of focus and emphasis on not only defunding DPD, which the language I use is reimagining public safety, but also investing those dollars in the Black community and other communities of color that have historically been underinvested in. And so the equality and equity are very different. We have to understand the difference of those things. And in order to make people whole and for Dallas to be a whole city, it must be an equitable city. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Councilmember Thomas, particularly the example and the resource around color of law. And what I'm hearing from our panelists so far is equity takes into account the unique characteristics and the historical context. Drexell, we certainly won't leave you out of this conversation. So if you want to add to this question around the difference between equity and equality, we would appreciate it. And then we will have you start off with our second question.
Sure. The only thing I would add, and I appreciate everything that you guys have all said already. The only thing that I would add is a term of phrase that Cint Marshall, the CEO of the Dallas Mavericks, uses, which is that she's talking about equity or diversity and inclusion, and she says diversity is getting invited to the party, but inclusion is getting asked to dance. And I always think that that's a really great way to sort of think about how you frame all the work that you may do or think you're doing or try to do around equity and inclusion, and really recognizing that it's one thing to have representation, but it's another thing for you to engage said representation. The last thing I'll point out is that at least in my own mind, equity is around recognizing that all solutions can't be the same. And equality is, in fact, providing the same solutions to all. And the recognition that we are all in different places, in different, and I'm a data guy by background, so that you can slice all of this work into any number of disaggregated perspectives and positions, but recognizing that how we got to those positions is all very different is, I think, a really important grounding for how you try to then put forward solutions that make sense. And I think failing to go through the sort of the grounding leads us to only pursue perspectives around equality. But if you've kind of grounded yourself in the facts and realities, it's a lot easier to pursue true equity and meet people where they are.
Thank you for that. And thank you for highlighting the diversity and inclusion around being invited to the party versus actually being included. And I would take it one step forward and think about equity as considering if that person has been invited in the past. And if they haven't, what do they need to know about that party to actually be effective or have a successful experience? Or be able to thrive in that particular party. So it's not just about being invited, it's not just being about included, but it's also about considering if they have been locked out of that party, then how can they be effective? What tools do they need to be effective once they enter that space? Drexell, will stay with you, move into the second question around budgets. Budgets can be viewed as a statement of a community's or organization's values. How would you characterize Dallas's values as reflected in our budget? How might we envision reallocating these dollars to best reflect the values we aspire? And let me know if you didn't catch all of that. I had some music in the background. We were talking about parties, so.
I heard it. By the way, I didn't say thank you for including me in this esteemed panel. It's always flattering to be asked to do anything, and I'm greatly appreciative of the opportunity. To your question, Dr. Wilson, I would say, so I came from a corporate background, so I'm gonna use my own corporate lens on this, but I'm a big believer that you need to understand exactly how you're spending your money before you try to plan your budget, right? So again, looking back at your historical context for what you've done and how you got there. I think the city writ large and, you know, Councilmember Thomas and many others in city staff and our elected officials, I think have done a really good job at taking a step back and saying, how did we get where we are and what might be a solution or a set of solutions for the future? And so, by the way, I talk a lot with my hands. So if you see me gesticulating, but they're not in camera, I'm still talking with my hands, you just can't see them. I think the budget process is designed to try to serve our constituents in the city of Dallas as best we can. And I think what's really important is sort of to the language that Councilmember Thomas used, to think about how you reimagine service provision for our city writ large. And not all services, I think, can be exactly the same as they were yesterday. They're not all going to be the same as they're not going to be the same tomorrow as they are today, right? But recognizing that we're trying to make sure that we can address or redress any of the issues that we've seen heretofore with meaningful solutions that have either been demonstrated to work or are anticipated to work because we've got a set of facts that imply that they will, I think is the process through which we have to go through. And I think the public comment section, the period of time right now when the budget's been laid out but not yet approved, is the time where we as lay citizens get to go in and tell them what we really think. And so I'm appreciative of the process and the fact that the budget planning allows for that. But I'm not sure that we're all the way where we want to be. And especially in the COVID era, I don't know that we will get to where we want to go in 1 year or in 2 years. But I think we're going through the difficult and important process of tearing it all apart and trying to figure out how we're going to make it work.
Thank you for that. And I would like to open the floor to either Angie or Councilmember Thomas to answer that same question surrounding how we might envision the allocation of dollars to best reflect the values we aspire.
I'll go next. That's my lane. So right now, oftentimes when we think about a budget reflects our values. And so as we begin the process of evaluating and making recommendations, amendments to the budget or this value statement, we need to be mindful of that. Who are we as a city? What do we value as a city? And those values should be reflected in that budget. As we begin to take the time to acknowledge the fact that Dallas is an inequitable city right now, our vision and focus should be on making Dallas equitable. We have to acknowledge, as you said, the historical context of how we got where we are today, and what we need to do in order for us to have a better tomorrow. There is a process called normalization. I learned this through going through racial inequity in leadership training through the National League of Cities. The normalization process is where we began to look at through objective lenses where we are and how we got where we are and where we want to be. Why is that important? That's important because we cannot continue to look through the lenses that historically we've looked through, which are white male lenses. We have to be able to look at the city from a multi-ethnic perspective. Once we begin to look at and value, and I think people distort the concept of Black Lives Matter. The whole idea of Black Lives Matter is there has been times, and there are still times, where Black people feel like they do not matter. Their thoughts, their opinions, their lives do not matter. And so it's important that if we're going to embrace this concept, then we began to look at something called white privilege. And we will look at white privilege, then we can better assess how we got where we are. And we have to make a determination, do we want to be that city or do we want to move in a different direction? And if we acknowledge the fact that we want to move in a different direction than a term that's not very popular, but is discussed more than it has been in the past. Reparations has to be put forth front and center. And when we talk about reparations, we're simply saying that the way in which we amend the unequal playing field of the past is we have to overinvest in communities that we have historically neglected. And as we develop our budget, we have to acknowledge the fact that, and my colleague Councilmember Tadeo Atkins says this all the time, Dallas is a tale of two cities. We have Southern Dallas and we have North Dallas. And we recognize the reason that North Dallas has 85% of our tax base and Southern Dallas is only 15% of our tax base is there has been an overinvestment in North Dallas. And in order for Dallas to be an equitable city, we have to now overinvest in Southern Dallas. Now, the challenge is when we look at the fact that these events, and this is an uncomfortable conversation. Equity and racial equity is an uncomfortable conversation, but it's a conversation that we have to have and continue to have. It shouldn't take a man losing his life publicly, televised, for us to have the conversation that we're starting to have. And the conversation shouldn't stop because we're no longer comfortable having the conversation. We have to begin with conversation, but actions have to follow conversations. And when I'm saying actions, we have to have individuals who are not Black or brown, who are saying the same thing and acknowledging the fact that this has to be a collective effort. White, Black, brown, and other all have to stand together and say, in order for us to have an equitable city, we have to be willing to sacrifice and overinvest in communities that have been discriminated against. And as we go through this budgeting process, I'm proud to say, for the first time ever, the city of Dallas is using an equity lens through every department as we develop this budget. And it'll be left up to the city council to keep this budget intact in an equitable manner or to make amendments to make the budget even better in a way in which we overinvest to address the racial disparities that have taken place in the past.
Ooh, thank you for that. Yes. One of the things that I want to speak to, as you mentioned it a couple of times, and I think it's particularly important, is that racial equity, right? And we know that race dictates outcomes across various, all of the systems, whether it be education, government and justice, health. And so when we're talking about racial equity, we're talking about trying to move towards a society where race no longer dictates your outcomes. And so one of the resources that you can, and I believe Joel sent it out, as the Equity Indicators Report. And that is right here in Dallas. And it looks at 5 specific areas and the ways in which, again, race dictates outcome. And so when you hear racial equity, it's important to note that given one's race, you can dictate the outcomes across various systems. And we've seen that with the pandemic and the ways in which previous inequities stacked on to the COVID-19 and created a disproportionate impact on Black and brown communities. Angie, I'm gonna throw it to you very briefly to add anything around how we might envision the allocation of dollars to best reflect the values we aspire.
Well, you know, that's one thing that we are having to consider. Historically, you know, funding is distributed pretty equally, you know, in our district as far as, you know, those dollars being, you know, allocated to each school pretty equally without any consideration to racial equity, you know, et cetera, socioeconomic. Most people don't realize that 60% of our schools actually are in Dallas proper. So we're Richardson ISD, but 60% of our district and our schools are actually in Dallas. And so really having to take a step back and analyze and reassess how that money is distributed and how it's used. And so one thing that we've been studying in my department, because we actually have an upcoming bond and putting together that bond steering committee, and we don't lead that work, the bond steering committee, but all of that is in process now. And so we are, volunteering to participate on that bond steering committee, because that's one thing that we do want to add to the conversation, that we need to start looking at, instead of, every school receiving, that equal cut, how do we more equitably serve our communities? One of the things that we studied last year was some data that came out with DISD, because they've done quite a bit of work using some data that the Child Action Poverty Lab actually put together for them, where they studied all of the different areas where the schools within DISD are, and they were able to identify some indicators for some needs for different communities. And so just really going and speaking with those who created those tools that they use to collect that data, how can we begin to partner with them to study some of our different areas, so that we can look at and make sure that as we think about the upcoming bond, as we think about reallocating differently, how can we best serve our communities? Right now we're looking at wraparound services that we really need for some of our high need schools, and how do we fund that, and how do we get that done, and really provide that community the services that they truly need. We're trying to be very transparent in that we know that we are trying to get there, right? We are making progress. We are making our way towards trying to serve all students and families more equitably. But there is a lot of work that we still need to do when we think about how we allocate and use our budget.
Great, thank you. And equity is always a topic I think people embrace until it comes down to the financial component of it. And so if I could just throw a follow-up question out there for any of our panelists to answer, what is your response when you get the question, or for those who may be thinking, hey, well, wait a minute, this isn't fair. I need just the same amount of the pie for my roads or for my student. What's a response that you have to that?
I'll go first. My response, the Socratic method of teaching is you respond to a question with a question. And so my response would be, was it fair when the resources were overinvested in North Dallas to build out parts of North Dallas at the expense of Southern Dallas? Was that fair? Was it fair when certain policies were implemented to allow veterans or those who came back from the war who were white to be able to get government funded education, government funding, housing, but those who were Black did not get a chance to have those same opportunities? It's real easy for people to say, why should I be punished? I didn't own slaves. Why should I be punished? I didn't institute certain laws. Well, you benefit. You benefit as a result of certain laws that were put in place. You reap benefits today of laws and of disparities that were put in place decades, in some cases centuries ago. Those who are the descendants of those plantation owners are wealthy today because those plantation owners at that time didn't have to pay for labor. And so we have to look at, in a historical context, where we are today and balance where we are today against where we were in the past. And so that would be my response.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Angie, go ahead.
Thank you. And I would just say, you know, we have been dealing with that in education. You see it across the nation. But when I talk about Richardson, about 2 years ago, we reconstituted 4 of our elementary campuses. And really what that means when you reconstitute is that you just kind of start over with your staffing, from your teachers to your administrators. And we had some schools in danger of failing. And so before you know, we allowed it to get to that point where, you know, where the state is really coming in and trying to monitor and take over. We decided to reconstitute, and we call those campuses our ACE campuses, a model that is used in DISD. And we took that and that model and we reconstituted 4 of our elementary campuses. And that's exactly what we heard, Lindsey, is that we're taking funding, necessary funding from other schools, you know, and putting it into these schools. And so our superintendent and our board, you know, had to have those conversations about the necessity of what we were doing frequently with the community. And so, and I think we just kept pointing them back to the data. You know, here we have 4 schools, and actually we could have reconstituted several other schools as well, but we started with 4 of the high need campuses. And so, but we just kept pointing them back to the data and really helping them to understand and owning what we've done traditionally in Richardson, that it's not working, right? And so we keep trying to serve, you know, under this equality approach, but it's just not working. And we needed to make some drastic changes, and we continue to need to make drastic changes in how we are providing programming and different initiatives. And we just can't serve every school the same. And so we keep talking about the achievement gap. We continue to be very transparent with those numbers. We continue to message that it's just unacceptable to have some schools with 100% passing rate in reading, 98% passing rate in reading, and then we have other schools with a 35% passing rate in reading. And just really going back to that achievement gap and coming up with those ways that we can really begin to close the achievement gap. And a lot of times that's going to start with money, right? And making sure that we are allocating the necessary funding into the schools that need that funding, so that we can get the teachers that we need, we can staff appropriately, we can look at you know, incentive pay, et cetera, to get those experts on the campuses to serve our underserved students. And so we are making some fantastic progress on those 4 campuses. And again, just continuing to point back to the data and being transparent with the data, and not trying to, you know, shield, you know, the public from what we are experiencing within our district anymore, and just putting that out there in a very transparent way and saying we have to move forward differently.
Thank you for that. Drexell, did you have something that you wanted to add?
They both captured it very well. I will add only that I think it takes strong leadership from Dr. Stone or from Councilmember Thomas and the mayor and others to continue to stand in the face of people complaining about how unfair they view something, and instead to fight for what they believe is right. And I think that it's really important to sort of make the distinction that fairness and right are sometimes very different. We're trying to do the right things for our community, not necessarily always the fair things for our communities. You know, we Dallas have a history, right? We are arguably one of the most, if not the most, segregated city, certainly segregated large city in the country. And that's a reflection of our policies and our history. And if we want to see different outcomes, we are going to have to do different things. You can't do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. And so I want to give credit to Councilmember Thomas in particular for fighting on this point, because it is critical and important to build the city we all claim and want to be. if that we have to do what's right and not what's necessarily fair.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to keep us moving right along to the next question. We have a little under 20 minutes, and so we'll get through some of these other important questions. Councilmember Thomas, I'm going to jump right over to you. During the first listening forum, that there was great dialogue around interpersonal versus institutionalized racism. And we know that equity calls for shifts of policies, practices, procedures, programs, and so forth. What would you say is the relationship between voter turnout, civic engagement, and equitable policy?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think civic engagement or voter turnout or participation can directly be tied to if individuals feel like they have been treated fairly, which is an equitable issue. The state of Texas has the lowest voter turnout of any state in the country, the absolute lowest voter turnout. There are a variety of reasons for that. Some say it's the stringent voting law, voter ID laws, and voter suppression tactics that have been implemented here in the state of Texas. I think a bigger issue is apathy. I think apathy is the biggest reason of that. And I think part of that is because a lack of true engagement, true voter education, true voter empowerment. And so when you talk about equity and you talk about civic engagement, people have to feel like they matter once again. They have to feel like their voice is being heard. We recently built a coalition called Our Vote is Our Voice, Can You Hear Us Now? And the whole point of that coalition was, one, to get people to come out and vote in the month of July when people had a number of concerns around the pandemic. But two, it was to engage people in a way in which they knew that their issues mattered. Those things that were important to them mattered. If we want to increase voter turnout, we do have to make it convenient. There was some discussion by our previous mayor and the editorial board about moving municipal elections to November when there are the presidential election, which happened this year. Coincidentally, we'll actually see that happen this year. But I think the bigger issue is, regardless of the timing, the true engagement, the true educational process, making sure people know what the issues are, know that their opinion truly matters. And it's up to the candidates, it's up to organizations to engage individuals in what those things that are most important to them. And so they see value in their vote. And so it's several different factors, but I think apathy and a lack of engagement is the biggest factor from an equitable standpoint. Not seeing those things that you value being valued. And if what I value is not valued, why should I actually go and vote?
Thank you for that. And Drexell, I'll pass the mic to you, the virtual mic to you, to provide some insight in that same voter turnout, civic engagement, and equitable policy. What's the relationship between that?
Sure. So, I think as a practical matter, politicians, right? We talk about voting. Politicians tend to listen to the people that supported them the most. That's not to say they don't, they exclude others, but like that tends to be the nature of politics, right? You tend to curry favor with those who support your perspective and point of view. And so, I think the concept of sort of equity is inextricably linked to how we hold our elected officials accountable for the outcomes that we get. And that's not to say that we should sweep everybody out and, you know, bring in a whole new crew. That's not at all what I'm advocating for. But I am suggesting that I think it's important for everybody to understand deeply who is doing what and why they're doing it. And that's that requires engagement. That requires, you know, civic engagement, if you will, focus, right? Showing up to listen to city council meetings, which is hard to do, right? They're in the middle of the day, all day, right? And it takes time and effort. But I do think that's sort of a critical nature of you know, the great American experiment, right? Is that we do have a voice, we do have an opportunity to hold people who make these decisions accountable. And if we're not getting the results we want, we need new accountability around that. And so I think that you will see going forward, I think, you know, the George Floyd protests have sort of inspired a level of determination, at least in the Black communities that I've engaged with, around continuing to show up, as opposed to sort of receding back to the background and the status quo taking over, right? But I'm cautiously optimistic we will continue to build and drive to be the Dallas that we want to be the Dallas that we claim to be. You know, I'm optimistic that we're not that far away from doing it. It's just a matter of continuing to support the people who have to make tough decisions, and then making sure we drive accountability around the decisions that get made.
Thank you for that. We're going to pivot the conversation slightly and zone in on the inequities that we see in our educational system. There's been a great deal of conversation surrounding the digital divide and the ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed inequities. Angie, starting with you, can you talk a bit about the racial inequities that are embedded in our education system as a result of institutionalized racism, which then was amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic?
That's a huge question, Lindsay. I think, you know, if you follow our superintendent, you've heard her, Dr. Stone, say publicly that we are looking at our policies and our procedures, our practices that perpetuate a lot of the racial inequities right now. And COVID absolutely highlighted that tremendously for us when we talk about the digital divide and just access to services. And so, you know, one of the conversations that I've been having quite a bit since, you know, we've been in this era of COVID is, you know, just thinking about our English learner families and how disconnected they became from education with COVID. You know, we think that we're doing a great job, right, until it's revealed that we're not doing a great job, particularly for us, you know, and for me, what was highlighted is our English learners and our English learner families. And so, you know, we had all of these systems in place, right, for communication. And, you know, we're sending calls out in English, we're sending calls out in Spanish, we're putting documents on our, you know, websites, you know, and they're translated in both English and Spanish. You know, but we like to celebrate and talk about how Richardson is such a diverse community and such a diverse district, and we, on any given day, there are over 100 different languages that are spoken. But yet when COVID happened, you know, it was easy for us to put everything out there in English. We have some experience putting it out there in Spanish, but then what about after that, right? And so you have all of these families, and even our Spanish-speaking families became disconnected, even though that material was going out in Spanish as well. And so it's just a different system to maneuver when all of our learners are now at home, right? And we are not able to connect with them face-to-face. We're not able to, you know, have their regular classroom teachers calling home and be able to, you know, speak to the parents directly. without having to get translation services. And again, it goes back to access, because now, the conversations we're able to have with some families, the first week of at-home learning and the clarifying and firming up, how we're proceeding forward, versus having to now wait a couple of days until we can get a translator in place and get our, printed materials translated. So that the whole system, for me, and this is my opinion, the whole system just kind of broke down. And what we saw was just, and I know you talked about the digital divide, and I think for me, what was highlighted just tremendously was how we disconnected with our non-English speaking families. And so we have to start considering and thinking about how do we serve, those communities better. And so that's a conversation that has been at the table all summer long, making sure that we have the pulse on our communities, even more so that when we start tomorrow, because we start back tomorrow in Richardson, that every family has been connected with. We've partnered with some different community programs to, really reach out. I mean, what we just learned, we have whole apartment complex, with families from, Afghanistan that we just lost touch with, right? Because of the ability to communicate. And so communication is absolutely key, and really looking at what priorities have we placed on making sure, even before COVID, right? What priorities were placed on making sure that we are able to communicate well with every single family. And so going back, to me, this conversation in my mind keeps going back to, wow, budgeting, because we've really had to look at our budget, and we've had to make sure that we've hired on some new directors for our translation services, going from part-time to full-time with several employees, just because communication for us was a huge barrier in making sure that all of our families knew how to proceed forward.
Things that you highlight that is particularly important is diversity is not enough, right?
Right.
Diversity off as that shiny coin, but
Right.
it's actually getting down to that historical context. It's getting down to that unique characteristics and the ways in which we serve the students in which we interface with. Councilmember Thomas, 1 minute, what would you, as a former teacher, as the chair of the WE committee, in 1 minute, what would you say around the ways that racial inequities show up, are embedded in education, the educational system?
One thing that COVID-19 has revealed, and it's revealed, to be honest, to people who don't live in the southern part of the city. We who live in the southern part of the city already recognize these disparities, but it revealed to people who live out north that we have disparities that exist from institutional and systematic racism. Why do I say that? I say that because when you look at statistics, African-American males are on the bottom of every academic category throughout the state of Texas, not just Dallas, but in the entire state of Texas. And so what this has done is this has revealed some of the things that many of us already knew. The challenge is for white people to acknowledge these challenges, to acknowledge these differences, and to stand with those who for years, decades, have acknowledged that these disparities exist from a systematic standpoint. We need white people to stand with us in Southern Dallas and say, something needs to be done. It needs to be done about it right now. We know that the digital divide has existed for decades, but until now, when we're seeing that children are unable to complete school lessons because of lack of access to technology, parents are unable to help their children with academic lessons because of lack of access to technology. And because the district as a whole is impacted by these scores and these disparities, now it's become mainstream. Now that everybody's saying ouch, once it hurts bad enough, we'll do something about it.
Yes, thank you for that. And Drexell, I'm going to pass the mic over to you, but I'm going to pivot the question and give you 2 minutes. As the Senior Vice President of Education and Workforce for Dallas Regional Chamber, what would economic equity look like here in Dallas? And what steps do we need to take to begin to pursue it?
Sure. So, Councilmember Thomas has been working with us on a new strategy that we're going to be embarking on at the Dallas Chamber that we're calling Dallas Thrives. It really is focused on an effort to tackle an equity gap in our young adult working population. So those who are between 25 and 34. Today, 25% of those folks makes a living wage on average across Dallas County. If you disaggregate that data, about half of our white residents make a living wage and less than a quarter of our Black and Hispanic residents make a living wage. We are about to embark on a big strategic push to try to tackle that over the next generation. Can we move the needle for our living wage workers in Dallas through education, through exposure to the workforce, through coaching, guiding, and mentorship, through all sorts of strategies? But in the end, can we move our community toward a more equitable and just community? We believe the answer to that is unquestionably yes, but we have to go do the work to make it happen. If we do that, right, if we successfully do that, right, we can add $1.5 billion to our GDP every year from moving residents to higher wages. We can add $40-ish million to our city budget because we have increased tax revenues. The economic return for this investment is huge. We think we have all of the tools. We think we have systems like Richardson ISD, Dallas ISD, others who are deeply invested in solutions. We've got great university partners. I think UNT Dallas. I think you guys had Bob Mong on an earlier one of these panels. Fantastic leader committed to equity in his community and his student base. We think we have a moment in time to start really addressing this, and we're going to be tackling that headlong over the next coming months and years. I have nothing but confidence and faith as a chamber, right? As a champion for the region, right? I have nothing but confidence and faith that we can be everything we want to be and say we are, but we got to go do the work, and then we got to see it show up in the data.
Yes, and just staying with that moment in time, and the final question before we take a couple of questions from participants. The final question is surrounding Dallas's recent declaration of racism as a public health crisis. The vote was unanimous and made the county one of the largest local government to do so. We know this is particularly important, going back to what you were saying earlier, Councilmember Thomas, around communities feeling heard, particularly the African-American communities, and the ways in which essentially 2 pandemics happened this summer, one that was not new. In 30 seconds, I'm going to give each one of our panelists, in 30 seconds, how would you say this declaration empowers the county to enhance equity for communities of color? I know it's under a minute, but we want to be respectful for participants' time as well.
I'll go really quickly. I'll only speak to a small element of this, but I've been co-chairing the Citizen Bond Committee for Dallas ISD's upcoming bond, which will be on the ballot in November, so please show up and vote for it. And one of the key elements of that bond is really this idea that we need to go tackle inequities in our community with physical dollars, right? Making sure that for communities that don't have grocery stores or internet access or whatever, that we are creating the right sets of resources around our schools that enable those communities to thrive, or at least try to thrive. And we're going to be tackling that with bond dollars in a committed way. And at least to me, like the resolution sort of as a representation of the fact that, like, we have to go make these kinds of investments with purpose, even though some people question it, because we cannot fix our problem by doing the same things we have been doing.
Thank you. 30 seconds, Councilmember Thomas.
Sure. I think more than anything else, it's a strong statement. It's a statement that we have been heard, that people who have been saying these same things for decades feel like now we have been heard by the county, and the county, our locally elected county representatives acknowledge the fact that racism and the effects of racism lead to stress, lead to high blood pressure, lead to many other challenges. And as I said earlier, this pandemic only unveiled the racial disparities that already existed as it relates to healthcare in particular. You know, Dr. Martin Luther King said that right is the voice of the unheard. And once people feel heard and they feel acknowledged, then they begin to feel whole. And once they feel whole, then they can take the action necessary in order to make things better for themselves and for the community around them.
Thank you for that. Angie, 30 seconds.
You know, I like to always help clarify that our schools are microcosms of our society. And so everything that is happening in society comes in with every single student to our buildings every single day. And so what I love about what is happening is because we're always trying to figure out, how do we get the community to respond? We can do what we're trying to do inside of our district, right? Inside of our buildings and our schools. But we need the community to lean into this racial equity work with us. And so with the passing of, and our Board of Trustees just adopted a racial equity resolution that's riding behind our RISD equity, diversity, and inclusion policy that was board adopted in June of 2019. But what I'm seeing now that gives me hope and is so motivating is that community members who were not listening initially, right? Community members who were unwilling to lean into this conversation, they're now listening. They feel empowered. They feel that they want to develop their voice around the racial equity needs in our district. And so we see different community organizations popping up. Mom groups all over Richardson ISD are popping up. So those who have never been empowered to be at the table and to feel like, or to have their voices amplified around this topic, are now allowing their voices to be used to rally for what we really need to get accomplished in our district.
Thank you for that. And thank you to all of our panelists. It's amazing to share this space with you, given the wealth of information, knowledge, experience, commitment that you have. Again, I told the participants early on, we were in for a treat. I appreciate, again, all of the insight, and we could have had this conversation for days. But given the time, I would like to pass it back to Joel for a couple participant questions.
Sure, and being sensitive to people's time, we'll take maybe one or two. First from Adam Lampert, past AJC Dallas president and member of AJC's National Board of Governors. He asks, I was part of a discussion last week with city council members to recommend zoning changes to benefit the low-income area of Vickery Meadow. I believe this was an example of city government giving attention to and investing in poor neighborhoods, as each of you have described. But can you talk about possible unintended consequences of government investment in these areas? A concern is that government dollars attract investors intent on pushing out low-income housing, resulting in poor people getting pushed out of the areas of development and growth. So, I mean, we could do a whole session on gentrification, but in 30 seconds, what can you tell us? Let's start with Drexell.
So I would say that's definitely a risk to the question that was asked. But I also think that there are smart and sophisticated and savvy ways for city government to incentivize and otherwise encourage kind of reasonable investment in communities where they aren't displacing folks, but they are still attracting capital. And that requires us to do some super innovative things. We might need to implement, property tax freezes as an example, while new development is going to pay their fair share. We may need to do different kinds of strategies to make this work. But I think we have to be prepared to, again, kind of tackle the complexities that come with the challenge. And I believe at least our elected officials and others are willing to have the hard conversation to try to start figuring that out.
Thank you. Angie?
So, I like to stay in my lane, so I'm not going to talk from the governmental end of that, but I will say that, in education, we feel the effects of it, particularly when we talk about students who are constantly in transition because of living arrangements and being pushed out of one home and having to go find new living quarters and spaces. And so if we can stabilize in that area, then it's going to benefit education because there's more stability as far as kids not having to transition so often and move from school to school. And we talk about the achievement gap and the learning gap. And a lot of that does come from kids always in transition. And so when you talk about our underserved students, and if we can stabilize them and keep them in our district, keep them on their home campuses without that constant transition, we can better serve them.
Thank you. And Councilmember Thomas.
Yes. When you're talking about zoning, and Color of Change talks about how zoning was used to intentionally keep African Americans out of certain communities. One of the best things that I've seen to counter the unintended consequences of development in particular is a community benefits agreement. If you're not familiar with that or anyone, I would suggest that look up community benefits agreement. This allows those who live in the neighborhood that are going to be directly impacted by that development to come up with their own list of really demands. If they want to get the commitment for them to sign off on a zoning change, these are things that the developer has to include. It could be a community park, it could be green space, it could be a variety of things. And that way, the community that's impacted by the zoning benefits from the development that's going to take place.
Thank you. And for a final question, first I want to echo the council members' praise of Lindsey Wilson earlier. I have been fortunate enough to have had the opportunity to have a number of discussions with you over the last couple of months, and I've learned so much and have started seeing things through an equity lens that I might not have otherwise. And before the program started this morning, there were a few of us on the Zoom already, and I was talking about an episode of John Oliver that I saw this weekend, and he did a whole 10-15 minute segment on jury selection. And I don't believe the word equity came up once, but it was very clearly about equity in jury selection. And this conversation and the dialogue that I've had with Lindsey and the learning I've done in speaking with her over the last couple of months has really led me to try to look for those opportunities to see things through that lens. So I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to identify one area that we might not instinctively think of through an equity lens, but that we should really focus that lens on. And let's start with Angie on that.
So for me, I always like to bring to the conversation when talking about equity is the disproportionality in discipline. You hear about the school to prison pipeline. I don't really think that people really understand what is meant when we talk about the school to prison pipeline and the inequities in our discipline that exist in our discipline policies and our discipline practices. And so that would be my one suggestion or what I would like to bring to the table. If you are unfamiliar with school discipline and disproportionality in school discipline, for you to really do some research and some learning and growing around that topic, so that we can really begin to carve out a different path for students and keep students in school, keep students with access to education, quality education, and stop pushing so many students into the juvenile justice system.
Thank you. Council member?
There are really a couple areas. One is equity and development, but as it relates to the current time, I would say equity in policing. When you look at the numbers, for instance, the district attorney, DA Crusoe, just did a briefing for our Community Police Oversight Board. He sent the council a copy of the briefing that he sent, the PowerPoint. What it was about was arrests as relates to marijuana possession. Or, it's not even close. It's not even close when you talk about the number of arrests for a small percentage of number of ounces of marijuana of Black and brown people compared to white people. And so what that leads people to think is there are more Black and Latino people that are smoking marijuana than white people. And we know, race has no, race is not a factor in who's smoking weed or not, okay? But when you talk about those who are being arrested for possession and small percentage of possessions of marijuana, then you see a huge disparity when it comes to Black and Latino or Latinx people and white people. So that's just one example in policing that we need to take a closer look.
And we actually have an expert in equity in policing on the Zoom today, and he's going to be one of our speakers next week. And so if you have an hour and a half to kill next Tuesday morning, I invite you to join us for that one. Drexell, let's hear from you on this topic.
Yeah, so as the chamber guy, right, I'm going to immediately sort of glom onto things that have a more economic outlook. And I'll say that, I think college and career readiness and access to opportunity because of that readiness is probably the single most pressing equity issue that I certainly, sort of look at and think about every day. How do I help more students who look like me get access to boardrooms and opportunities that some of us may otherwise take for granted, and how we know that talent is distributed everywhere, but opportunity is not, and we have to do a materially better job at unlocking all of that talent and getting it to its highest and best use and place, so that we can all be our best version of ourselves. And so that starts with how many kids can we get, to high school graduation ready to enter the world, and continue to do good things. And we have a long way to go, but I'm appreciative for great leaders like Angie, and for Casey, and for Dr. Hinojosa and Dr. Stone in Dallas and Richardson respectively, who are really pushing on these important issues to create economic opportunity for all our students.
Great. Well, with that, I want to thank our audience today. I want to thank our panelists and our moderator. This has just been a stellar session. And as we remind everyone each week, this listening tour is intended as an important step in mutual understanding of complex, long-standing issues. Conversations like this are meant to be a precursor to action and advocacy, and not an end in and of themselves. Next week, as I mentioned, we'll have our program on policing. We'll hear from Dallas Police Chief Renee Hall. We'll hear from Tanya McClary, who is the police monitor for the Office of Community Police Oversight, and Drew Diamond, who is, in addition to being the former police chief of Tulsa and an expert in equity and policing, is also executive director currently of the Jewish Federation of Tulsa, and has also gets a gold star because he's attended every session of this so far, and we welcome you now and look forward to hearing from you next week. And with that, I want to thank everyone again, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone again next Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock for our policing session. Bye now.
Thanks for having me.